Thomas Keith. He's the editor of New Directions Publishing in New York, where he has edited books by Dale Thomas, John Gardner, and Jimmy Santiago Barra, among others. He's also done also edited plays and poems and poetic writings of Tennessee Williams, most recently the reissue of Memoirs. If you haven't read Memoirs, I would urge you to do so. It's a great book. Keith has written and lectured on the work of the Scottish poet Robert Burns, and will participate in the other festival that is staged here in May, Saints and Sinners, the Alternative Literary Festival. It's my pleasure to welcome back and introduce you to Mr. Thomas Keith. Thomas?
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm going to start right off by introducing our three panelists. To my immediate right is Mr. David Kaplan. David is a New York City native, a theater director who stages plays around the world with professional companies in indigenous languages and settings. Some of these include productions of King Lear in Uzbekistan, Genèse the Maids in Mongolia, and A Midsummer Night's Dream in Buryatia, Siberia. Is that correct?
Buryatia.
Buryatia, all right.
Where they speak Buryat.
Buryat. Since 1993, he has directed plays in Russian, in Russia, including Macbeth, A Wilderness, and the Russian premiere of Anti-Maid. He has also directed several...
Somebody had to do it.
He has also directed several Williams plays. In 2003, Mr. Kaplan staged The Eccentricities of a Nightingale in Cantonese at the Hong Kong Repertory Theatre, where he previously directed the first production of Suddenly Last Summer. And he also directed The Traveling Companion at Westbeth in New York and The Frosted Glass Coffin in Birmingham, Alabama. He is the curator and co-founder of the Provincetown Tennessee Williams Festival and the author of the book Tennessee Williams in Provincetown, which was published last year by the Hanson Publishing Group. His current production of two Williams one-acts, The Traveling Companion and The Chalky White Substance, had their premiere this week here at the festival and will also be performed at the Tennessee Williams Festivals in Columbus, Mississippi, and in Provincetown in September. Mr. Kaplan is also the author of the 5 Approaches to Acting series of college textbooks and has written a wide variety of scholarly and feature articles. His translations of Chinese poetry from 18th century Japan appeared in the inaugural issue of the journal Ale House. He is also a raconteur, bon vivant, and man about town. To David's immediate right is Mr. John Waters. Born in Baltimore, Maryland in 1946, Mr. Waters began as a teenager making 8 millimeter underground movies. The first, which happens to have my favorite title, was Hag in a Black Leather Jacket in 1964. In 1972, he created the most notorious film in the American independent cinema of the 1970s, Pink Flamingos, which turned John Waters into a cult celebrity and became a smash success at midnight screenings all over the world. Mr. Waters released Female Trouble in 1974, Desperate Living in 1977, and Polyester in 1981, starring Divine and Tab Hunter. It was filmed in glorious odorama. Ticket buyers for Polyester were given scratch and sniff cards that allowed them to smell along with the characters. In 1988, Mr. Waters' big-budget comedy Hairspray was a box office and critical success and starred Divine as Edna Turnblatt. It has since been adapted into a Tony Award-winning Broadway musical with Harvey Fierstein as Edna Turnblatt, and now that musical has been made into a film with John Travolta starring as Edna Turnblatt. His next feature films include Cry Baby in 1990, Serial Mom in 1994, Pecker in 1998, Cecil B. Demented in 2000, and A Dirty Shame in 2004. Mr. Waters is the author of several books, including Shock Value and Crackpot, as well as several books of screenplays. He is also a photographer whose work has been shown in galleries all over the world, not least of all here in galleries in New Orleans. Mr. Waters performs his one-man lecture entitled This Filthy World across the United States and in a video released by Netflix, but going beyond Netflix in June.
Comes out, yes.
As an actor, Mr. Waters has appeared in many motion pictures, including Sweet and Low Down, Blood Feast 2, All You Can Eat, Seed of Chucky, And he currently plays the Groom Reaper in the new court TV series, Till Death Do Us Part. The ultimate trash masterpiece, Pink Flamingos, was in theaters for a 25th anniversary re-release in 1997, complete with newfound footage. Commenting on the long-lasting popularity of the film, John proudly remarked, "It's hard to offend 3 generations, but it looks like I've succeeded." Mr. Waters is also known as a raconteur, bon vivant, and man about town. To John's immediate right, we have Dr. Kenneth Holditch, author, scholar, professor emeritus, and Mississippi native. Dr. Kenneth Holditch received the first PhD in English ever awarded from Ole Miss. He taught at the University of New Orleans for 32 years, and didn't tell me which years. In 1974, he was named Louisiana Teacher of the Year, and in 2001, he received the Lifetime Achievement in the Humanities Award from the Louisiana Endowment for the Humanities. He is one of the founders of the Tennessee Williams Festival in both Columbus and Clarksdale, Mississippi, and of the William Faulkner Words and Music Festival in New Orleans. He was one of the founders of the Tennessee Williams New Orleans Literary Festival here, and has served on its board. Dr. Holditch knew Tennessee Williams and introduced him at his only public speaking engagement in New Orleans in 1978. He is the author of numerous essays on Southern writers, short stories, and poems. He also has written several books. Co-author along with Richard Freeman Leavitt of Tennessee Williams and the South. Co-author along with Marta Burton of Galatoire's Biography of a Bistro. Co-editor along with Mel Gussow of the Library of America volumes on Tennessee Williams, literary executor of the Thelma O'Toole estate, and such wrote the introduction for The Neon Bible by John Kennedy Toole. Currently at work on completing a revision of Richard Freeman Leavitt's The World of Tennessee Williams, which was unfinished at the time of Richard's death. Dr. Holditch, it should be noted, attended junior high school in Tupelo, Mississippi, where he was a classmate of Elvis Presley. Dr. Holditch is also a raconteur, a bon vivant, and a man about town. However, Dr. Holditch has the distinction of also being a much admired curmudgeon. Thank you. With these 3 raconteurs, I thought I should say something. Anyway, as you all know, the memoirs were just reissued, which is why we're having this panel. And as part of the reissue, John Waters agreed to write an introduction. They were first published in 1975, and they were a bestseller for a long, long time on the New York Times bestseller list, very popular. And to the same degree they were popular, sold well, well-read, they were critically just lambasted. I mean, the critics just tore them apart, didn't like them. It was a bad time in Tennessee's life for a number of reasons, and they really let him have it. So there are some questions about why reissue them at all. But the first question I'd like to ask the panel is, why do we like them? Why do we like the memoirs? And why do we still read them? Gentlemen?
I liked them because, to me, in 1975, it was very rare for people to even say they were gay or tell any stories or anything. I think Tennessee before had been the first one that on Dick Cavitt's show, they finally asked him if he was gay, and he said, well, I cover the waterfront. You know, that was the first time he ever owned up, and that was really a big deal to say on national television. So I think if this book came out today and any writer or any celebrity told the stories in here, every celebrity biographer now is filled with stories much more lurid than this. They won't even publish them if you don't tell them lurid stories. So to look at it now, to think he was incredibly brave to do it at the time and to say this, and it reads like he's having a good conversation with you. He's telling stories, having a couple drinks, he's funny, he tells the truth, he puts himself down. At the same time, he says, anytime somebody calls me a genius, I feel in my pocket to see if they're stealing my wallet. He has some really great lines in it. So I think it just reads very, very well, and it makes you like him. It's like Uncle Tennessee sitting around telling you a story.
Did he do it for the money?
Well, they said yes, but I wonder. I'm sure everybody does stuff for money. We have to work, and this huge advance he got was $50,000. That shows the difference of the times,
I don't think he did it for the money.
No.
I mean, no. I think that's how he excused what he did. He had told some of these stories before, and in writing this book, he was retelling them, and he was constructing a persona in public, which included being gay, and included discussing openly and with irony his sexual appetites. And I agree with John. It was an extraordinarily brave thing to do, and a very heroic thing to do, and he does it with wit.
Yeah.
And that's a... No, I think he had something to say in this book, and he said it.
Yeah. Well, I think that story, I did it for the money, was a way of demurring.
To say it as a joke, in a
Yeah.
way, because that was also literarily incorrect.
Right.
To ever say,
Right,
I did it
right.
for the money. You don't say that when you're
Well,
Tennessee Williams.
You know what, also, as we're talking about it, it's at this period that he's also hanging around the factory, and he's friends with Warhol, and that's a very Warholian thing to say.
But even he was with Paul Morrissey the most,
Yes,
and I always say
yes.
that Paul and he should have hooked up the way at the very end Douglas Sirk and Fassbinder did. They reinvented each other, and I always think that they could have really done something very well together.
Yes.
Well, of course, he always said that he was very upset about the fact when he started to write the book that he discovered that somebody else was getting like 3 times as much money as he was getting from Doubleday, and he was very upset about that. And so he said, I just wrote it and got it done. And there's an interview with Eric Paulson, who is a local newscaster here, and in which he said, he asked him about the memoirs, and this was, I think, in the late 70s, and he said, well, I would go home at night, and I hadn't worked on it, and he said, oh my God, I've got to work on those memoirs. And he would sit and write, and he liked to claim that it didn't mean anything. Of course, he did that very often. But I think the interesting thing is that now that we've read the letters and Margaret Thornton's book, The Notebooks, she's edited, that we suddenly, realize a great deal more about Tennessee than we did. And I think it reveals I will say this, that as a scholar, when I was working on Tennessee Williams in the 1970s, and of course there was, when I went to places in New Orleans, and I won't name any resources here, but I would go there and say, do you have any information on Tennessee Williams? And they'd say, no.
Yeah.
Like this, no.
Yeah.
And then the memoirs came out, and as a scholar, it's maddening to try to find anything.
Well, I don't think a lot of the hustlers were,
No.
that scholarly, really.
No, that's...
I mean, if you ever believe that quote he supposedly said is, my type doesn't know who I am. What a great quote.
Well, he was also perhaps, or was, I should ask, was he perhaps finally sort of standing up to and having his say with a lot of the bad reviews, the negativity, and the outright nastiness and homophobia?
For a long time, too.
Since the 50s.
Yeah, he wasn't social climbing with this book like Truman Capote was.
No. He was letting him have it. Well, it's interesting that not too often do 30-year-old books get reviewed, but Andrew Holloran wrote a review, and he said, yet the real joke in these very funny memoirs, something he knew would annoy his critics, is that he talks about everything but his vocation. He's too cagey, too superstitious, too worried that, quote, the shadow of the hawk's wing may fall on whatever element of the unconscious it is that creates his plays. Of course, he says, I could devote this whole book to a discussion of the art of drama, but wouldn't that be a bore?
Yes.
Well, and he's...
I mean, he had given many interviews.
Yeah.
It's not like he had never talked about it before.
Yeah.
This he hadn't talked about.
Right.
And he's protecting himself in this. He doesn't want to talk about that. The door is closed. I'm working. Goodbye.
Right. He says, this is from the memoirs, why do I resist writing about my plays? The truth is that my plays have been the most important element of my life for God knows how many years, but I feel the plays speak for themselves, and that my life hasn't, and that it has been remarkable enough in its continual contest with madness to be worth setting upon paper. And my habits of work are so much more private than my daily and nightly existence. So in John's introduction, he says, and we've covered a little of this, but I think it's worth asking, why was Memoirs reviewed so badly when it came out in 1975? In a review of Tennessee Williams' letters to Donald Wyndham, Robert Brustein wrapped them both up by saying, "The love that previously dared not speak its name has now grown hoarse from screaming it."
Yeah. I feel that today about some writers.
That's true. Well, now we feel that.
Yes. But I think in a way that people just weren't ready for it. A playwright then, when you with that kind of background and all the awards and the seriousness, they want him to stay serious then. This was before Warhol. Warhol did have a lot to do to change that.
Yes.
To take celebrity and make it funny and mock it and be famous for being famous and all that. And this is before that. And Tennessee is basically having fun for once about being a celebrity. And that was literarily incorrect at the time, especially if you were a Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright and everything. You weren't supposed to talk about your sex life or your personal life or your failures even.
And
Go ahead.
I also think that I am the student of the three people that wrote the nastiest reviews of Tennessee Williams ever, which is interesting. Richard Gilman, who began his review of Night of the Iguana with Mr. Williams, he dead. Stanley Kaufman, who did the infamous article in the New York Times that said, Williams and other gay writers can't really write women characters, they can only write men in drag. Lovely article. And Robert Brustein, who had many, many choice things to say about Williams, and a vocabulary, a true vocabulary of homophobia with words like fruity and impotent and
Impotent?
impotent. Well, couldn't get it up. Yeah,
I know, but those are different gay men than I know. They can't keep it down.
And I think that in the same way that there was resistance to black writers identifying themselves as black writers, that there was resistance to gay writers identifying themselves as gay writers, that they were writers who, oh, by the way, were gay and we don't want to talk about that. And he broke.
Yeah, but wouldn't you say Tennessee today would say he was a writer who was gay?
Yeah, well,
Gus Van Sant and I always laugh when they
he-
mention us, openly gay director, like I walk in, hi, I'm gay.
Right.
Get
Well,
on my
no, and I
nerves,
actually
you know?
think Tennessee resisted what you were saying.
He was
said
a playwright
in-
who was gay.
In interviews, he didn't want to be known as a gay writer, but it was a continuation after that David Frost interview, I think, where he could actually really come out on his own terms, and that's what he does in the memoirs.
And say, this
he
is
makes
part
it
of
clear.
my identity. I'm
Right,
not
it's-
embarrassed by it. It's
Right.
as true as my mother. Not my mother, his mother.
I wouldn't bring his mother up. So in John's intro to the memoirs, which is delightful, and I recommend you reading it, he says, Tennessee Williams was my childhood friend. I yearned for a bad influence, and boy was Tennessee one in the best sense of the word. Joyous, alarming, sexually confusing, and dangerously funny.
Well, that's true, you know, and I still look for people like that. Because he wasn't gaily correct even. He even then made fun of it and had fun with it. And Tennessee, his whole life, he didn't go to gay bars. He liked a mixed crowd. He liked women. He liked everybody completely mixed up, which I do. I like bars where you don't know who's what. It's more fun. You can hear, I like to hear a hetero's bad night too, you know?
Well, and this ties in with that. In some respects, and I think this is part of what he was just reacting to, there couldn't be any writer much more commercial or mainstream than Tennessee Williams when it comes to certain plays and films. And yet, when speaking of his early days in New Orleans, he says in the memoirs, and this is something John points out in his intro, my place in society then and possibly always since then has been in Bohemia. in what ways was Williams an outsider, a bohemian, and in what ways did he remain so to the end of his life?
Well, certainly he didn't choose to live on the Upper East Side. I mean, he did the opposite of Truman Capote, that basically, I think, kind of ruined his career by caring so much about going to parties all the time and being with rich people. Tennessee, I don't even think liked rich people that much. I mean, he would much rather he lived in Key West, he lived here. He didn't surround himself with the chic, he liked that some, but he needed to get away from it. He certainly didn't write about that. That wasn't his beat. So to me, Bohemia is the first thing I wanted to be in too. I wanted to be a beatnik, and Bohemia is still the best place. And I believe everybody in this room probably identifies with Bohemia. And so Tennessee spoke for those people. No matter what edge of Bohemia you were on, they didn't have the word outsider, and I hate that word now. I want to be an insider because everybody thinks they're an outsider now. But Tennessee was the first outsider that I knew about and read about, and I didn't know there was such a thing when I was young. So when I read him, it was this great freedom. I thought, I knew I didn't have to believe this crap they're telling me. I don't have to be like these people that everybody wants me to be. And I didn't know he gave me the freedom to do what I wanted to do. And I think he did for many, many people in the 50s, certainly. That when those plays came out, I mean, besides having the best titles of any plays in the whole world, he freed everybody. I mean, because these were subjects that people that didn't talk about.
Yeah. Right.
Not just being gay. I mean, all of it.
All those subjects that became sort of treated as sensational in the publicity. They were talking about that yesterday. How
in the movies they always cut it out.
But they would sell it as sensational whether they cut it out or not.
Yeah.
And Robert Bray was saying how with Baby Doll, there isn't a nude scene in it or a dirty word or anything else.
Oh, that movie. God,
but the publicity was such that you would have...
Cardinal Kitty Spellman. He's the main one that came out against that, And he was the one that said you'd go to hell if you saw it and everything. And
Which is great publicity.
I know. Well, I remember I was obsessed by it.
Made
Edith
film.
Massey in the crib in Pink Flamingos is the bad end of Baby Doll.
Thomas, could I read this little passage from the memoirs about
please do.
Bohemia? He said, I was alone and lonely, this is 1946, and I began to look at advertisements for furnished apartments in the Vieux Carré, where I'd lived on previous days in New Orleans. I was so fortunate as to discover a lovely furnished apartment on Orleans Street, half a block from the rear of St. Louis Cathedral. It's right across the street here. You can see it. You can see the balcony over there. It had a lovely gallery, and sitting out there on that gallery, I could see the garden behind the cathedral and the great stone statue of Christ, his arms outstretched as if to invite the suffering world to come to him. That season in New Orleans, I did not live alone, but with a friend. Due to the uncompromisingly honest nature of these memoirs, which their names link to mine in their stories of my life, I understand and respect this preference. I could invent them as characters the way one might in a piece of fiction, making them different from themselves, but that would violate the first premise of this book, and so I'd rather admit them entirely, however regrettable a gaffe that makes. And he goes on to say, as to that particular friend, this is Pancho Rodriguez, who occupied the center of my life from the late fall of 46 till at least a year later, and who continues to be among the closest of my friends. Let me only say now that he relieved me during that period of my greatest affliction, which is perhaps the major theme of my writings, the affliction of loneliness. At first, I lived a very reclusive life for a resident of New Orleans, but in that gregarious city, but I reduced my activities mostly to that of writing. At first, it was difficult, and then he goes on to say, eventually, that season I was entertained a great deal by the elite New Orleans society, which in those days resided mainly, if not entirely, on the far side of Canal Street, which is called the Garden District. One evening I decided that I felt well enough to give my socially elite friends a party in my little apartment on Orleans Street. Probably some of the young debutantes had never before entered an apartment in the Vieux Carré, unless it were in the Fontalba building that were on Jackson Square, the only respectable dwellings in the quarter. I mean, recognized as such by the Garden District mothers. My party was a curious occasion. I remember a young debutante asking if she could see my bedroom. Why not? It's very nice, I said. He's going to show us his bedroom, exclaimed the young lady. The whole party trooped in. They seem to like the bedroom. Who wouldn't? The bedroom is either the loveliest room in the place of residence or the most abhorrent. This one belonged to the first category. Then somebody turned to my apartment mate, that's Pancho. Now show us yours, he said. Oh, he probably knew that a scandal was brewing and would have wished to avoid it, but I found it perfectly natural to say we share this room. I thought the silence that followed my statement was not natural at all. You see, the bed was somewhere between a single and a double. Debutantes began to whisper to their escorts. There were little secretive colloquies among them, and presently they began to thank us for an unusual and delightful evening and take their leave as though a storm were impending. I suppose it was better that way. My place in society then, and possibly always since then, has been in Bohemia. I love to visit the other side now and then, but on my social passport, Bohemia is indelibly stamped without regret on my part.
All right. Just to continue on Bohemia a little bit, perhaps if this is Bohemia. I wanted to talk about the bad Tennessee Williams DVD set that Mr. Waters has referred to. That hopefully Mr. Waters will make sure gets done. He wrote in his introduction to the memoirs, maybe I like bad Tennessee Williams just as much as good. Bad and good both being in quotation marks. This year, a box set of DVDs was released containing all of Tennessee Williams' best reviewed movies: Streetcar, Cat on a Hot Tin Roof, Sweet Bird of Youth, Night of the Iguana, and The Roman Spring of Mrs. Stone. But I want the bad Tennessee Williams box set. Boom, the greatest failed art film ever made, directed by Joseph Losey, starring Elizabeth Taylor as Sissy Goforth, the richest woman in the world, and Richard Burton as the Angel of Death. Last of the mobile hotshots, the film version of The Seven Descents of Myrtle. This property is condemned with Natalie Wood, and even Noir et Blanc, the 1986 Claire Devers film version of Desire and the Black Masseur. The bad Tennessee Williams is better than most of the good of his contemporaries.
Well,
Do you have anything to add to that?
I think Boom is, if you haven't seen Boom, I mean, it is the most unbelievable movie ever made, and a failed art film. I mean, she's the richest woman in the world. He's the angel of death who visits rich ladies right before they die. And Noel Coward plays the Witch of Capri in it, where they asked Katharine Hepburn and she turned it down, supposedly insulted to have been asked. I love that. In the film, they eat, Noel Coward, she has them over for lunch, and they eat sea monster. It's unbelievable. And her performance, and I met Elizabeth Taylor the one time I met her, and I told her, I really love Boom, and she said, that's a terrible movie. She got really insulted and thought I was making fun of her. And I toured the country with the one print of Boom that there is, that Universal has, and to film festivals all over the country and showed it. And it is really a great movie, and they made it drunk, though, basically. Joseph Losey directed it, and he said in the movie they started every morning shooting with cocktails, really, Bloody Marys, which is hard to do at craft service the first thing in the morning, but that he also said that Losey that he was the first person to ever lose money with the Burtons on this movie, and this was a huge flop. This movie, but the set is unbelievable. It was shot in Sardinia, and supposedly they were so drunk that the Burtons tried to buy it, and people had to report, well, there's no roof, there's no plumbing. Oh, that's right. They wanted to move into this house, which I do too. But Tennessee in the book talks basically about how first it was a play, and when it was Tab Hunter and Tallulah Bankhead, if you can imagine, and it was in Baltimore, and my parents didn't take me, and I feel that's child abuse. No, I just want to tell you at the end that basically Tennessee always thought Boom was brilliant, and he says in this book that at the end he thinks it's the best movie that was ever made of all his things, and he say one day the acclaim will come to this movie. Well, I'm trying to prove it right.
I asked all three raconteurs to pick out a favorite section from the memoirs to read, and Kenneth has read his. Do you want to read this?
I'll read
sort of
a
couple,
little bit. I
different.
told you some of it already, but
Starts there.
if you write a play with a very strong female lead, such as Flora Sissy Goforth of The Milk Train Doesn't Stop Here Anymore, it is likely to surface repeatedly, since female stars of a certain age have a rough time finding vehicles suitable to their talents, personalities, and their public images. To call Milk Train, which was the correct title, they renamed it Boom. That must have been a desperate marketing meeting. And then they added an exclamation point the day before it opened. That's not even on the credits in the movie. It was like, boom! Oh yeah, I saw it. To call Milk Train a vehicle is somewhat unfair to it, in that the play, really only successful script-wise as the movie Boom, I was fanatically obsessed by trying to say certain things. It is very sad that the Tallulah didn't play it about 5 years earlier, but it didn't exist then. When it was ultimately given it to her, it was simply too late. Tallulah no longer had the physical stamina to put it over. She was too deep into liquor and pills, and she had great difficulty into projecting clearly to the front of the house. So he meets Joseph Losey, and Joseph Losey says, "I'll do it if you put Tab Hunter in it." And I love Tab. I mean, I think he's a great actor, and Tab has told me about this thing. He said when he did the play, no one could hear because the whole balcony was Queens that just screamed every time she said anything. It's like a gay Beatles concert, basically. So they picked Tab, and he's saying, I was reluctant to accept Tab Hunter since I could not see him in a mystic and ambiguous quality which the part demanded. Tony, the director, said to me, I have a moral obligation to Tab Hunter, and casting him as Chris will pay it off. I can only surmise what the moral obligation may have been. So he goes to, and it opens in Baltimore, and it's a complete disaster. It was a disaster always. So nevertheless, it was purchased for the screen. The negotiations were very involved. The lively little fingers of Lester Persky were hotly engaged in this project. But he ends at saying that history moved to, despite its miscasting, I feel that Boom was an artistic success and that eventually it will be received with acclaim. So, I think really there is a video out of it. It's not great. It's a Penniskin. There's never been released a beautiful DVD, but sometimes it's on television. You can see it, and they have the real print uncut. And if you can ever see it, I mean, Tennessee Williams is right. I think it was meant to be a comedy, and I think it's really funny and insane, and your mouth will fall open. You're like stupefied when you watch this. Because there's one point in it where Richard Burton says, the milk train doesn't stop anymore, and they dub it in where it just says, boom. So it's not the boom. And then there's many shots in it where they cut to the crashing ocean, and then Richard Burton says, boom, the sound of knowing the next moment you're alive. I say that daily.
Well, I saw the first production of Milk Train Doesn't Stop Here Anymore in Philadelphia. This was not with Tallulah Bankhead, but with Hermione Baddeley and a dreadful actor whose mother was financing the play. His name
Paul Roebling.
His name was Roebling.
Roebling.
And he later became a very good, apparently very good director. But he was absolutely horrible. But other than, it was a fascinating play. Mildred Dunnock was the Witch of Kepler, and it was quite a different play, I think, from what it was with.
And Marion Seldes was Blackie, wasn't she?
Yes.
Really?
Yes.
And I met, in the movie, the costumes, which are staggering, are credited to Zani of Rome, and I had never heard of that. Karl Lagerfeld told me, I worked for him. I helped design those clothes when I was a kid. He did the clothes in Boom. So.
There are headpieces in there that are so heavy, Elizabeth Taylor can barely walk.
Yeah.
She steps like this.
Yeah. Well, that's the cocktails, too, maybe.
Well, as long as we have had our first two excerpts from the Raconteurs, perhaps, Mr. Kaplan, you would read your excerpt.
I'm less of an ironist. I'm sorry, and
What's an ironist?
Being ironic.
No, I didn't mean that ironic.
I don't know about that.
Well, I wear my heart on my sleeve a little bit, obviously, with Williams. And when Thomas asked me to pick a section, my first impulse was to pick the extremely graphic description of sex with a woman, which I thought would be very unusual. And I asked Pat Brady if she thought that was appropriate, and she didn't say no, to her great credit. But he did. No, but there is a passage in here that I like very much. And I just want to point out that there's an echo of Walt Whitman in it, and that America right now offers so many things to the world that many of us are embarrassed about. And it's important to remember what we offer the world that is great. And I work around the world doing Williams, and what I read is an example of what's great about him, I think. And I think that's true for Walt Whitman and for Emily Dickinson. And notice that those are also outsiders, to use the bad word, in American society. This is very, very towards the end of the book. He says, he's talking about his life at the time he's writing. He says, "Of course I will continue to work, but not to trick myself into supposing that what I now accomplish still has the vitality of my work at full tide, when it sprang like the torrents of spring." He quotes poetry. "How perilously do these fountains leap, whose reckless voyager along I am." Ugh. Lines from an early poem when I was bursting with images, but had not yet broken the confines of iambic pentameter. What else while waiting? Being a sensual creature. And why do I keep saying creature instead of man? I will go on doing what I am doing while waiting. I will comfort myself with good wine and food, but not to drunkenness and grossness of the flesh. I will try to hang on to those friends who have remained friends despite my difficult, angry years, which I think are now past. And I still hope to have, both spiritual and carnal knowledge of a desirable young companion, not as frequently now, but at prudently spaced intervals. I shall not indulge in vanity, but I shall cling to pride. Two very different things. One being weak and indulgent, the second being strong and a necessity of survival with honor. Do you think that I have told you my life story? And that, by the way, is the echo of Walt Whitman. I have told you the events of my life and described as best I could, without legal repercussions, the dramatis personae of it. But life is made up of moment-to-moment occurrences in the nerves and the perceptions, and try as you may, you can't commit them to the actualities of your own history. The work of a fine painter, committed only to vision, abstract and elusive as he pleases, is better able to create for you his moments of intensely perceptive being. Jackson Pollock could paint ecstasy as it could not be written. Van Gogh could capture for you moments of beauty, indescribable as descent into madness. And those who painted and sculpted the sensuous and the sensual of naked life in its moments of glory made them palpable to you as we can never feel with our fingertips and the erogenous parts of our flesh. A poet such as the young Rimbaud is the only writer of whom I can think at this moment who could escape from words into the sensations of being. Through his youth, turbulent with revolution, permitted articulation by nights of absinthe, and of course there is Hart Crane. Both of these poets touched fire that burned them alive. And perhaps it is only through self-immolation of such a nature that we living beings can offer to you the entire truth of ourselves within the reasonable boundaries of a book. If that's the case, well, the inadequacies of this attempt to tell my life story, and believe me, I've tried to tell it, may be, surely must be, to my advantage, and I trust no serious disappointment to you.
It's a very New Orleans book. I mean, you find a lot about New Orleans in here. The most important passage being, when I die, I hope it's in my apartment on Dumaine Street, that's 1014 Dumaine, in my brass bed, which has so many wonderful memoirs of Frank Merlo and my life with him. And of course, he died in New York in the Elysee Hotel, which was quite a different story. But I mean, he had this incredible love for New Orleans, and I think that's why it's very important we're doing this here in this city.
Well, my next question actually was for all of you, but you in particular, Kenneth, which I think has something to do with this, and that is the style in which he wrote the memoirs is interesting, and it's not that no one had thought of that style before, but it's a kind of stream of consciousness where he jumps in and out of time and takes off the pressure off himself, one, of having to be a researcher and a historian, and two, allowing it to be a little free form, which also seemed to be closer to the way he was writing other things at that time. And did you ever talk about this, or what do you think of it?
I think that's probably true, that he was, he was, by this point, he was, I think he did, I really believe, though I don't think he was capable of writing a really, really bad thing. So I think if he thought, well, I'm going to write this because I want to make the money, and they gave more money to somebody else, but I think he got into it and it turned out to be good. But I think he was, it was certainly very free form, and I love the way he goes from past to present. He said
it's over a 3-year period.
How was he in the scale of drinking and drugging?
Better.
Oh,
yeah, this is
you
where
couldn't have written this if you were completely...
Well, some people could have, but he had dried up. I think he really bottomed out, if he ever bottomed out, around 69, 70 when he was in the hospital in St. Louis.
Yeah.
And, was in better shape at this time. Unfortunately, we don't have that second Lionel Leverage biography, which...
And never will.
Given us a day-to-day blow.
I would also say that there's a technique to this. It's not just randomly switching from past to present to even future when he talks about where he wants to die. This is a technique, his mix of use of time. Look at it in The Glass Menagerie. There's an action that's happening on stage, and there's a narrator that's telling it after the action is concluded. And at this point, he's beginning to get the idea for something cloudy, something clear. And in a random comment to Dodson Rader, he says, well, the person I'd really like to have play me in this play, where it's a 29-year-old character, is Henry Fonda, who's 75 at the time. And it's not that Tennessee Williams is out of his mind in that way. It's that he wants to have a 75-year-old man play his 29-year-old self on stage. And in the play itself, there are very delicate and nuanced shifts between the person telling the story to the audience and actually being in the play. And I think that that's true for this book as well. There are very delicately and nuanced shifts between I'm telling you this moving story, and then I pull back to tonight I'm hanging out at the truck and warehouse, and we didn't sell 12 tickets. And this is a deliberate, not just a distancing, but he's constructing an identity in the way that older people don't just see reality, they see the past at the same time. You know yourself, if you live a certain age, that when you meet someone new, they begin to remind you of people that you've met before, and that there's a double exposure of memory and perception, and he uses that in this book.
Very effective.
Let me ask you something. There are a few vocal people that always say there is a complete different version of this that he wrote, and that Doubleday. Is that true at all?
Well,
I don't know anything about
let me just tell you what I know.
Yeah.
And that is that when the book was scheduled, we decided to do it, and you had kindly agreed to write the introduction, and everything was underway. I went to see Andy Brown at Gotham Book Mart, and he said, well, you could have done the complete version of the memoirs, but I didn't want to say anything. I was going to call Peggy, and I didn't call. I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, the unedited version.
Yeah.
I said, what unedited version? He said, well, there's an unedited version. I said, well, where is it? Well, it's up at Harvard. So I started asking around. It turns out that Fred Todd had one, which is now in the New Orleans Historic Collection. And another phone call shortly thereafter, I was speaking to Mitch Douglas, who was Williams' third agent at ICM after Audrey Wood and Bill Barnes. And he said, oh, yeah, and I've got that unedited manuscript of the memoirs. And I said, would somebody please get me a copy? So anyway, I'm trying to get my hands on a copy, and we'll see.
And who edited? I mean, are you saying he turned that in, and then Doubleday edited?
And what was the name of the woman at Doubleday?
Oh, I forgot.
Catherine somebody. But yeah, it was definitely, and from what they're describing, for example, the Xerox fee from Harvard, I went to apply for to get a copy, was $1,000. So it's a lot of paper. Now, how...
Do you think things that were cut out because they were more sensational, or just they were too long and
you get
rambling?
different
Yeah, I think
stories
that's
from
what-
different
yeah.
people. David Cuthbert heard that Tennessee said that somebody stole it out from under his bed in Key West. Andreas Brown said that there are wonderful sections in there. You've got to find them. And Mitch Douglas said, it's filthy. He said they would never have
Well, I'll
published
write that volume too. I'll do
But
that.
anyway, we're going to get our hands on a copy and we're going to look at it.
10 years,
And
right?
if there's something to be published in there as, stories, short memoir, whatever, then 2011 at his centenary might be a good time to bring it out.
The dirty part.
We'll see. And the dirty, or we could just have a separate book of dirty stories.
Well, Thomas, I do know that in the early years, and those of you who were involved with the festival 17, 18, 19 years ago will remember that Bill Gray came a couple of times and appeared on the panel, the I Remember Tennessee panel. And Bill Gray was a very good friend of Tennessee's. He met him in the French Quarter one day when Tennessee was walking through the quarter, and Tennessee took him home, and they got to be very, very, very good friends. And Bill Gray taught at, he was from somewhere in Louisiana, I forget exactly where, but he taught at Randolph-Macon College. So Tennessee had a whole section devoted to him, according to Bill Gray, in the biography, in the memoirs. And he got in touch with Bill Gray and said, and gave it to him and said, read it, do you think I can publish it? Because he's teaching at this college. And this is, in the 70s, and that was not the sort of thing you wrote. And Bill Gray said, no, I don't think you can. So Tennessee gave it to him. Now, when Bill Gray died, Jack Fricks told me this, that when Bill Gray died, Bill Gray's nephew called me, and he was an Episcopal rector. And he said, I want to talk to you about Uncle Bill. And I said, okay, and we talked a while, and he said, I've got some papers of his and letters from Tennessee, and I don't quite know what to do with them. And I said, well, they'd be very valuable, and I'd love to see them and whatnot. And apparently he destroyed them. So there may have been copies, but I think they're
Well, what
gone.
Fred had was definitely a copy, he was
Yeah.
telling me. So in the Historic New Orleans collection, there's a copy of what... But again, I don't know if these are different versions, different
Right.
parts
Mitch
of the
Douglas,
draft.
first draft.
It's this endless story with Tennessee Williams where you've got to, look at the material to find out.
Yeah.
Well, it's time for... Well, it's a little early, but I still think it's time for question and answer. But just in case nobody asks me the question, I'm going to have the first question and the first answer.
You
And I'm going to
deserve
have it because I've heard two occasions where somebody has said to John Waters, why did they ask you to write the introduction, Mr. Waters? And he said, I don't know. They just asked me. And then recently said to David Cuthbert, well, Thomas Keith at New Directions called and gave me the gig. And I'll give you the slightly longer version, not a super long version, along with the thumping music of the Bourbon Orleans. And that is that, we've reissued some of the plays. We had the introduction by Arthur Miller for Streetcar and Edward Albee for Cat. And when the early plays were published, we had the scholarly editors, Nick and David, as well as a foreword by Eli Wallach and Ann Jackson. And it makes sense to not just send these things out naked, but to make some kind of an invitation to the reader, because there is a reassessment after all these years. And we were looking at the two main works of Williams that New Directions had never published, Moise and the World of Reason, which was a novel that he wrote in 1975, and Memoirs. But we were really looking more at Moise and thinking this novel, while we think it should be in print, is troubled. It's a difficult novel in a lot of ways. And people were resisting it, and I said, no, we just have to find the right person to introduce it. And we were thinking, and scholars and actors and critics and playwrights, and we were thinking of the memoirs too, and we weren't coming up with anybody good for the memoirs either, because again, the memoirs were troubled in a different way. because they had taken so much abuse, and there was this reputation for being lurid, and even though they're tame now, we just wanted to find the right match. And I don't know where I heard it or where I read it, but I read somewhere John Waters saying that Boom was his favorite film. And this bell went off, and I thought, oh, I have to find out more. And because I knew it had been on 10 different critics' 5 worst films of all time list. And I had seen it and loved it. I thought it was hilarious. So I thought, well, maybe John Waters for Moise. Well, we couldn't untangle the rights. They were tied up with Simon & Schuster, and there was a problem with them. And I mentioned this to Robert Bray, because he's going to work on it when we do it. And then the memoirs came up. And I was saying, we were talking about it in the office, and I said, well, I was thinking of John Waters for Moise, and they said, well, no, he's better for the memoirs. Everyone there was like a pile on. And I said, well, you're right, but will he do it? I don't know. I don't know if he likes Tennessee Williams. I don't really, well, I know I like Boom, but, and then this fax came from John's assistant saying, I received, I bought a copy of the Letters Volume 2 in cloth, and the dust jacket was mangled. Can I have a new dust jacket for John? And I thought, sure, maybe this is my chance. Because the other thing is if you go through people's agents, I didn't know if you had an agent, but if you go through
I got plenty of them, yeah.
You go through their agent and you ask them to do a project like this, it's the last thing an agent wants. It's like no money and, get out of here. And so I thought, well, maybe I could write to John directly this way. And so I got the dust jacket wrapped up, and I put in a copy of Mr. Paradise and one of those little posters of the books, and I wrote a letter, and I went up to the front desk guy at the time, Kurt, and I said, would you UPS this to this address in Baltimore? And he looked at it, and then he looked, and he opened a drawer, and he had a fax from a few months earlier signed from John Waters with the same request. And I said,
For the book jacket.
why didn't you give this to me? And he goes, I didn't think it was John Waters. I said, Baltimore? Anyway, so I wrote to John, he accepted, and he exceeded all expectation. We were so happy.
I said yes in about 1 second.
We were so happy he was willing to do it, and he did a beautiful job.
Thank you.
And part of the story that I forgot to tell in there was when it did come up for the memoirs, they said, well, what do you want? And I said, I want someone who won't be apologetic. And people said, well, John Lahr won't be apologetic, or this actress. And I said, no, I want somebody who won't be apologetic, and somebody who's funny, and somebody who's gay. And they said, well, then John Waters.
I got the job doing the Mommy Dearest commentary by saying, I think it's a good movie.